When I first wrote this script, this introduction mainly talked about how the Duke men's tennis program wasn't as historically successful or popular compared to some of Duke's other programs, but by the time I was about to start recording, I realized that the idea of Duke tennis not being as popular was starting to end, not just inside of Duke, but in the collegiate tennis landscape. Duke has made some shockwaves, bringing in one of, if not the largest transfer portal class in college tennis history. Now don't get me wrong, I'm a huge fan of the transfer portal and I'm so excited to see what this new reloaded team can do next year, but I also think that if we look at what the transfer portal has done for college football and basketball, there are some worrying results. 5 of the last 7 Heisman winners have been transfers. Now it's impossible to tell if the same thing will happen in tennis, a sport where the spotlight isn't as large and no professional scouts to impress, but I think it's fair to assume that we'll see a huge increase in the transfer portal in the next few years. The main thing I'm worried about is the loss of the 4-year superstar, a freshman who comes in and dominates all 4 years to become a legend at that school. Hey, future me here, so I gotta come clean. This next part is extremely boring. I keep yapping and there's little to no visual stuff happening, so just for the sake of me editing and you watching, I'm just gonna fast forward through this all. Let's talk about the greatest Duke tennis players of all time. I fooled you. We aren't going to be talking about the players just yet. I figured it was best we start with the head honcho of every tennis team, the coaches. There have been exactly 3 great coaches in Duke's tennis history, starting with John LaBar, who, as a side note, doesn't really have any photos of him on the internet, so I'll be using a picture of his book instead. Duke tennis started in 1904, but it took until 1943 for Duke to see its first tenured coach with Bob Cox. But in a 19-year career spanning 2 stints spanning from 1943 to 1970, he was barely above 500 and had a losing ACC record. No. The first truly great coach in Duke's history was John LaBar. LaBar coached 11 years, from 1971 up until the 1982 season, with his last season being the best record in Duke's history. He led the Blue Devils to an incredible 31-4 season, going undefeated in ACC play. There are only 3 regular season losses, being to Arkansas, California, and Trinity. Right now, Trinity is a D3 college in Texas, but at one point, they had one of the best tennis programs in the nation, evident by them beating USC in the NCAA tournament that year. They reached further than Duke, who finished their season off with a loss against TCU in the first round. In fact, every team Duke lost to made it to the tournament, with Arkansas being the only team not to make it to the quarterfinals. After that season, he stepped away from coaching to become the director of undergraduate studies for the university, retiring with a 183-89 coaching record, makes him the first great coach. But he isn't the greatest. Without much competition, that goes to Jay Lapidus, the second great coach. After the departure of LaBar in 1982, Steve Strom coached for 7 years, but in 1991, Lapidus stepped up and took the reins. His tenure lasted 17 years, from 1991 to 2008, with the all-time school record in years coached, matches won, and winning percentage. Crazy 371 to 127 record, and in 133 to 20 ACC record says it all. On top of all of that, he's won all of Duke's 11 ACC titles, placing him 3rd among all ACC coaches. This is the part where I would mention his peak year, but I don't know if I really can. Outside of his last 2 seasons, and maybe a fluke 2002, he never had a double-digit loss season. One could argue his peak was maybe the 24-4 season in 2001, but there's also an argument that his peak was legitimately 1991 to 2006. In that time span, They won 11 out of 16 ACC tournaments, with the 2006 rendition being special, as Duke came down 0-3 to finally win 4-3 in one of the best ACC title showdowns of all time. But his last 2 seasons after that ended the exact opposite to LeBar. LeBar went from a 15-13 season to a 31-4 turnaround just 2 years later in his final season. Lapidus went from a 22-7 season to an 11-14 slump just 2 years later in his final season. After that, he was promoted to director of tennis and eventually rehired as assistant coach in fall of 2023. His love of the game and winning mentality coached him to being the best coach in Duke history and the second great coach of the program. The last great coach is Ramsey Smith. As a son of tennis royalty Stan Smith, he had big pressure on his shoulders from a young age, and I would say he's been successful in those expectations as a coach. After stepping up in the absence of Lapidus, Smith has had a record of 290-136. Although not as winning as his predecessor, his 2025 team is reloaded for a monster year that looks to be a defining year in program history. Just like Lapidus and LeBar, he's had his ups and downs. He's had 25 wins on several occasions, but also has had many double-digit losses seasons, including a span of 4 straight from 2016 to 2019. Although having a successful coaching career, his playing career at Duke was arguably much more impressive, but that's for later. His sheer longevity and ability to lead makes him our last great coach. But behind every great coach is an equally great roster, usually led by an all-time player. You kinda see where I'm going here? Let's talk about the GOATs of Duke tennis. Like in most sports, great players of early generations suffer from many issues keeping them outside of the GOAT debates. These mainly boil down to playing in a weak era, and in most cases, just not having the raw stats that modern players benefit from. This is no different in the case of collegiate tennis. Duke has probably had great players in the pre-World War days, but there's just no way we can consider them some of the greats when the competition was much weaker than it is now. For that reason, the first GOAT candidate we'll talk about started in 1992, after the LeBar tenure and early into the Lapidus era. This is Chris Presley. This is also Chris Presley, but famously, he didn't play tennis at Duke. This Chris Presley did. He was really good at it. His freshman year wasn't too impressive, but he picked up steam in his sophomore campaign. He made it to the NCAA singles tournament where he matched up with a third-ranked player and lost in 3 sets. Despite this, he finished the year ranked 17th in the nation and named an All-American in singles after not being ranked the year prior. The next year, at the singles tournament, he was ranked 5-8, the highest of any Blue Devil yet. I think I should explain that ranking quickly. People not familiar with college tennis, this seems like a weird seeding. Like, what do you mean 5-8, and why not an actual ranking spot? I'm not completely sure. All I know is that they just didn't really bother to seed 5-8 and 9-16. As of current, they do seed 5-8, but still leave 9-16 as a collective seed. It's kind of weird, and there may be some other stuff here that I don't really know about, but you kind of get used to it. But now back to Presley. After being ranked 5-8, he made it to the round of 16 before losing to an unseeded Mike Sell in 3 sets. This also marked the first time a Duke player had made it to the round of 16 since 1970. For his incredible play, he finished the year ranked 6th in the nation and retained his All-American status, being the first back-to-back Blue Devil All-American. Duke also won the ACC tournament, and Presley was named the tournament MVP. He was primed to make an incredible run in his senior season, and he did just that. Kinda. Disappointingly, he went into the NCAA tournament ranked 9-16, but went all the way into the quarterfinals before losing to the first seed in, you guessed it, 3 sets. This was the furthest anyone had ever made it into the tournament, but his ranking was dropped to just 14th in the nation. Despite this, he was still selected to the All-American team, finishing his career with a then record of 3 All-American selections. His consistency right out of the gate was unmatched, resulting in some crazy stats like being part of the 100-win club, the 5th highest singles winning percentage of all time, and being on some freshman leaderboards. It was his performance in the postseason that puts him on the list though. Every time he lost, he always took it to 3 sets, including against the top-ranked player in the nation. And raising your game when it matters the most is a sign of a GOAT, but it's kinda hard to argue Chris Presley over the next guy. it looks like we have a familiar face. As I mentioned earlier, Ramsey was a good coach, but an even better player, so I think we should switch up his pick a little. That's much better. Considering that I already kind of spoiled how great of a playing career he had, it might come as a surprise that he didn't really have an amazing start. Sure, his freshman year was pretty good for a first year, but he failed to make an All-American team or an NCAA tournament in his first 2 years. But it was his junior and senior years that really solidified his position as one of the greats. In 2000, an unranked Smith lost in the second round of the singles tournament to the number 2 seed in a 3-set battle. But it was his performance at the NCAA doubles tournament that was his greatest run. Again unseeded, but this time, alongside Doug Root, made it all the way to the semifinals before finally bowing out. On top of being named the ACC Tournament MVP, he was also named an All-American in doubles, with his partnership and Root being ranked the 5th best in the nation. His senior campaign didn't really reach the heights of his junior season. He did become the only player in Duke history to win back-to-back ACC Tournament MVPs, but a 9th through 16th seeded Smith lost in the round of 16 to the 7th seed from the University of South Carolina in straight sets. His doubles tournament was even worse. Unranked and with a new partner, Smith ended up losing in the first round in straight sets, marking the end of his tenure as a player. He still finished the year as an All-American in singles and a final ranking of 17th in the nation. Although he may have peaked higher than Presley, his season-by-season analysis didn't really seem to hold up to Presley, so what makes you so confident to say that he's much better? I think it comes down to 3 things. The first are the ridiculous stats. I mean, just look at these. Not only his stats, but he experienced a lot more team success. As a player, he won the ACC tournament every year, including 2 back-to-back MVPs. That's real team domination. And the last thing was his versatility. Not only was he a great singles player, but arguably even better as a doubles player. At the end of his playing days, he joined Doug Root as the only player up until then to be named an All-American doubles and singles team and finished with the most wins in school history. In my opinion, those put him solidly above Chris Presley in the GOAT debate. Oh yeah, and his doubles partner in his last year? His name was Philip King. For being one of the best players in Duke's tennis history, his LinkedIn is surprisingly bare. If that were me, I would be bragging about all of my tennis accomplishments, but his time as Duke was summed up in just 3 words. Such a humble LinkedIn, but his start to his career was anything but humble. As a freshman, he made the NCAA doubles tournament with Ramsey, but that was nowhere near the highlight of his first year. The singles tournament saw King ranked 9th through 16 before losing in 3 sets in the quarterfinals. Most players would never come close to success like this, and as a freshman, King dominated. Of course, he was the highest ever seeded Duke freshman and quarterfinalist yet. That kinda goes without saying. He was a consensus All-American in singles, ITA Rookie of the Year, and finished the year ranked 9th in the nation, becoming the second ever Blue Devil to be ranked in the top 10 in singles after Presley's 1994 season. Coming off an incredible freshman season, he had high expectations to reach the next year, and although I wouldn't say he surpassed them, he definitely didn't fail to meet them. Again ranked 9th through 16 in the singles tournament, but this time being upset in the round of 32. It was his results at the doubles tournament that elevated his season. Partnering Michael Yanni, the unseeded duo upset the 3rd-seeded team in the quarterfinals before losing to the 2nd-seeded team in the semis. Even though his performance at the singles tournament wasn't what everyone expected it to be, an ACC Player of the Year and an incredible regular season pushed him to the 13th ranked in the nation. Even more than Ramsey before him, this was definitely the best singles and doubles season in Duke history. He became the first Blue Devil since Mark Fleur in 1983 to be named to both the singles and double All-American teams in the same year. And even if he stopped playing at this point, it would be hard to argue against him making this list, but you gotta remember, we're only halfway there. But his junior season didn't come close to the heights that his previous years reached. An unseeded King lost in straight sets in the first round of the individual tournament, and doubles wasn't much better. Despite being seeded 3rd, the highest Blue Devil rank up until then, King ended up losing in straight sets to an unseeded team in the 2nd round. In their defense, they were up against a certain Rajiv Ram, so it's kinda hard to fault them for losing. He ended up losing his All-American status in singles, but retained his doubles status, with the team finishing 4th in the nation. His final year suiting up in blue was definitely defined by his rebound back into singles form. He reached his highest seed in the singles tournament yet, with the 5th seed. On the way to a seeded loss in the quarterfinals, he defeated Ken Skupski, the brother of former number 1 ranked doubles player Neil Skupski. With him not competing in the doubles tournament, he ended up losing his All-American doubles status, but regained his All-American singles title with the 13th finish ranked in the nation. 3 singles All-American titles, 2 double All-American titles, and some of the best stats in Duke history. Unlike Ramsey and Presley, he came out of the gates swinging with a dominant first half to his career. And although he didn't have the strongest junior season, his combined dominance on both the singles and doubles courts, along with being an All-American every year, is kinda hard to argue with in the GOAT debate. His stats are just insane. I had to find a new text-to-image editor for this part because his accomplishments exceeded the character limit on my usual one. Also, come on man, really? You chose those shoes? Those are what my dad would wear when he goes walking. Those don't really scream tennis legend. But I digress. When you think about it, it's kinda wild that the career of 2 GOATs just so happened to overlap. I mean, what are the odds that it happens again? It happened again. Frenchman Ludovic Walter played the first half of his career with Philip King, but it was only when King left that Walter really shone through. His first year was pretty uneventful, with no tournament appearances, but did lead the team in wins and was an Alt-ACC selection. His sophomore year saw him lose in the first round of the singles tournament, but just like Ramsey before him, it was his doubles play that shone through early on. That year, alongside partner Jason Zimmerman, the team entered the doubles tournament as a 5-8 seed, but eventually fell in the round of 16 in a 3-set match. He was of course named an All-American in doubles, and the pairing finished 6th in the national rankings. Just 1 year after Philip King was seeded 5th in the singles tournament, Ludovic Walter took a spot as the 5th seed, but a straight-set loss in the round of 32 was a disappointing result to say the least. Despite this loss, he finished 8th in the nation and was named an All-American in singles. Next year he did even better, keeping his 5th seed in the singles tournament, but this time making it to the round of 16. Again, not what he was expected to do, but his opponent was Somdev Deverman, that year's runner-up, who was just starting his campaign as one of the greatest collegiate tennis players of all time, so it's kinda hard to fault him for that loss. Also, as a side note, I had no idea Somdev now has long hair and makes music. Kinda cool. Of course, Ludovic was named an All-American in singles again, but this time finished 5th in the nation, marking the highest finish of anyone in Duke tennis history up to that point. Despite only having 2 All-American singles caliber seasons until this point, he still managed to surpass Ramsey's total singles win record with an easy win over Boston College in his last year, putting him at the top. And it wasn't just the amount of wins, but also who he won against. He defeated several top 10 players, including a win over number 2 Ryler DeHart of Illinois in straight sets in his junior year, who at one point was considered the best player in the nation. He also plays pickleball now. Ew. It kinda goes without saying that Ludovic had some crazy stats. Funnily enough, while I was making this video, I calculated that his career combined singles and doubles wins was around 215, but Duke doesn't officially recognize him as part of the 200 wins club, which doesn't make sense unless they don't count invitational and tournament wins, which frankly is just silly. I think I'm going to start a movement to get Walter inducted into the 200 wins club. Now, I don't think he had the longevity or peak of King, but he certainly made an argument with some high caliber defeats. I think there does exist an argument to place Ludovic at the top of this GOAT list, but it's just so tight between Ramsey, King, and Walter. Ramsey had the best consistency across his career, King had the highest peak, and Walter had a little bit of both. I think a good graph might help us decide. Here, I plotted a graph of the highest season win totals, along with the career wins of the players we've talked about. I also took the liberty and graphed some other members of the 200 win club that I don't really mention in this video. It seems like Root and Hemmeler should be in this GOAT debate because of their career and single season achievements, but in actuality, I think Root and Hemmeler are probably the 2 guys that fall right off of our list for a couple of reasons. Mainly the fact that Hemmeler wasn't nearly as successful with nearly no tournament appearances, and Root didn't peak as high as anyone else here, with his doubles numbers carrying his far inferior singles record. To be completely honest, I was a little surprised when I made this graph for the first time. I expected King to be higher up on the highest season win totals, considering he was the 2nd combined singles and doubles All-American in school history, but I don't think he played as many matches in a season like the others. But I think the graph shows that clearly the 2 standouts are Ludovic Walter and Ramsey Smith. and there isn't much separating them. It's super close, and we're kind of splitting hairs here. Walter was probably the better singles player, but Smith winning almost 15 more doubles matches gives him the edge in combined totals. Honestly, I'm not too sure who I'd pick as the best between them and for the title of the best Duke tennis player in history. Good thing I don't have to. Let's talk about Enrique Cunha. If Duke tennis was more widely appreciated, I think Cunha would be more well known as one of the Duke greats, regardless of any sport. Even to my friends who are very knowledgeable in the history of many Duke sports, Cunha remains unknown. And I think here lies a big reason why I started to make these videos. How many legends like Cunha exist in other Duke sports that most people just don't know about? I don't know, but that's neither here nor there. What is here is Enrique Cunha, the undisputed GOAT of Duke tennis. Although that's not what Wikipedia says. If you look up Mark Fleur, his page states that he's widely considered the greatest Duke tennis player. Was it because he's the only men's tennis player in the Duke Hall of Fame? Which is also wrong to all the GOATs we just mentioned. Mark, what is this? They did you so dirty. Sure, Fleur was great, but I don't think he even comes close to what Cunha did. Maybe there was an argument when he had the highest career singles winning percentage when he played, but guess who's on top now? Spoiler alert, he's on top of almost every single statistical record and achievement. Every single time I've mentioned someone getting a top ranking, seeding, or achievement, quote unquote, up until then, it's probably because Cunha holds the current record. Take for instance me talking about how King was the highest seeded freshman yet at the singles tournament. In Cunha's freshman year, let me reiterate, his first year of playing college tennis, he was the number 1 seeded player in the whole nation. Just let that sink in. He also faced 3 straight seeded opponents before losing in the semifinals to eventual champ Bradley Klahn. This run included a win over future number 1 ATP doubles player Robert Farah. Side note, Farah is the second future number 1 doubles player we've seen so far. Including the brother of Neil Skupski, it kinda feels like all we're missing now is Austin Krajicek and Joe Salisbury, and we would have had the complete list of college double number 1s. To pair with the top singles seeding, he was also the top double seeding with Reed Carleton, which I don't even know if I have any words for. For over a decade, he was the only Duke doubles number 1 seed until this past year when Garrett Johns and Pedro Rodenas reached the top seeding. And just like the pairing from this past year, Cunha and Carleton ended up losing in the quarterfinals to the eventual champions in a close match. It's not completely impossible to think that if they won a couple more points to win that second set tiebreak, Cunha could have been a champion in his freshman year, but sadly, that wasn't what happened. Still a crazy run nonetheless. As you can probably guess, Cunha was the easy ACC Player of the Year, ITA Rookie of the Year, Singles and Doubles All-American, and a final ranking of 3rd in singles and 1st in doubles, and an absolutely mind-blowing 80 combined wins that year. Although Farah was 1st in singles and 2nd in doubles, his combined points average was lower than Cunha's, statistically making Cunha the best all-around player in the nation that year. And on top of all of that, he became the first Blue Devil to take down a number 1 player when he defeated Steve Johnson in straight sets. Now this wasn't GOAT Steve Johnson, but a still strong player nonetheless. Now the question is, how do you follow a season like that? Well, one way to do it is to drop to the 8th seed in the singles tournament, losing the quarterfinals to familiar foe Michael Shabazz, going to the doubles tournament ranked 5 through 18, and again losing the quarterfinals to probably the greatest player in Georgia Tech's history, Kevin King. Interesting. Also, the media guide that I got this from made it seem like they were unseeded this year, which just isn't true, and I believed it up until I was creating this part. SMH, dude, get your stuff together. The bright spots for this season was beating number 1 ranked and professional Jack Sock lookalike Ryan Williams in straight sets, before getting demolished by Steve Johnson in the middle of the greatest collegiate tennis run of all time. He was still a singles and doubles All-American, but finished the year 9th in singles and 7th in doubles. The fact that beating the number 1 player in the nation, getting to the quarterfinals of both tournaments, Being a combined All-American and finishing in the top 10 of both singles and doubles would probably be the greatest season of all time for anyone else, but it's considered one of Cunha's worst seasons is just mind-blowing. It's not the worst though, because that honor goes to his junior season. Sure, his singles seeding jumped up to 5th, but again, lost in the quarterfinals to 3rd seed Eric Quigley. Again, he entered the doubles tournament unranked, this time partnering Chris Mengel, but they ultimately lost in the round of 16 in a 3-set battle with the 4th seed. Oh, hello again, Bradley Clown. He ultimately finished 4th in the nation in singles and was an All-American in singles and doubles. Wait, what? For the first time, he wasn't a combined All-American, but he was just so close. To be considered for a doubles All-American, you either need to be a top 8 seed in the doubles tournament, reach the quarterfinals, or end the year top 10. He was one set away in the tournament from reaching the quarterfinals, but there is a world where he isn't in that position. See, that year, Cunha didn't just play with Chris Mengel, but also played some matches with Fred Saba. The Mengel pairing finished 18th in the nation, while the Saba pairing finished 21st, meaning that if he had just one partner for the entire year, there is a serious possibility that they get a top 8 seed, make it to the quarterfinals, or finish top 10, thus retaining his doubles All-American status. So although he doesn't get the 2012 doubles All-American title, I still think he deserves it nonetheless. That round of 16 loss is the only loss he's ever had before the quarterfinals, and the only one he'll ever have. I guess that's kind of spoilers for his senior season, but we're already here, I guess. His singles ranking dropped back down to 8th, but he only lost 10 games en route to the quarterfinals. Ultimately, his sheer consistency ended up being one of his biggest strengths, but also one of his biggest knocks. In singles, never losing before the quarterfinals, but also making it to only one semifinal. There might be a world where a couple of games goes his way and he's able to make it to a couple of finals, maybe even winning some. But in the world we live in, he's quarterfinals Cunha. Not a doubles though, as Cunha partnered with Hemmler, grabbed the 2nd seed and made it all the way to the semifinals before losing it straight sets to the 4th seeded team from Virginia. Not the first time he's lost to a doubles team from UVA that went on to win it all. With those results, he finished 5th in singles and was the #1 doubles team in the nation. He also became the first Blue Devil since Doug Root to make the singles tournament every year. The only Blue Devil ever to be ranked in every year that he's competed in this singles tournament, and to appear in every single doubles tournament. He easily retained his singles All-American and regained his doubles All-American, making him the only player to be 4-time singles All-American, as well as the only 3-time doubles All-American. Side note, on the Duke Media Guide, it said he was a doubles All-American, but I double-checked and he was a combined All-American, so someone should probably fix that. He's also the runaway ACC Player of the Year and finished 5th in the nation in singles and 1st in doubles, also making him the only person to be ranked within the top 10 for 3 years, let alone his 4 years. He was also part of the only 2 doubles teams that finished the year with the #1 ranking. Do you see why I was so astonished when Wikipedia said Mark Fleur was greater than all of that? I mean, literally, the only 2 blemishes in his career was his inability to get to a finals and not being named an All-American in doubles in 2012. Every other part of his career was about as close to perfection as you can get. I mean, to put it into context, I tried to pick out some of his best stats and my hand legitimately got tired from typing them all. This isn't even all of his stats, I just couldn't type all of his records out. I think he has a legitimate case to be one of the greatest college tennis players of all time. Now, I do think there is a tier separating him from the likes of Somdev and Steve Johnson, like the difference between S and S+ tier. But he firmly cements himself as the GOAT of Duke tennis. He belongs to stand above the rest, but just below him are the other greats, the GOATs before Cunha, Presley, Smith, King, and Walter. And just below them are the ones that could never quite make it to their heights, like Doug Root, Rafael Hemmler, Reed Carlton, Rob Chess, Nicholas Alvarez, Garrett Johns, and of course, our good buddy Mark Fleur.
Sensational.
Going into this next year, Duke tennis is looking scary. Although a decent amount of seniors are leaving, Duke tennis joins baseball, softball, basketball, and football as major programs rebuilding through the transfer portal. The idea of transferring in college tennis is much newer, with the transfer wave hitting a couple of years after it hit nationwide for football and basketball, but Duke has taken full advantage and brought in 7 new players from the transfer portal, with Duke bringing in perhaps the largest tennis transfer of all time in freshman Cooper Williams. As a freshman at Harvard, he made it to the round of 16 in the singles tournament and was the Rookie of the Year. Along with 6 other highly touted transfers, the 2025 team is going to be scary. Might be the second best Duke team led by a young white guy named Cooper. Like I mentioned in Chapter 1, this year could be a career-defining year for Ramsey, up there with the likes of Labar's 1982 and Lapidus' 2001. But as much of a fan as I am of the transfer portal, I do believe that because of it, getting stars to commit as freshmen and staying all 4 years will become harder and harder, making Cunha's and the other legends' career records become more and more untouchable, in a weird way kind of cementing their legacy. Or not. I don't really know.